When we were exchanging suggestions about what to call it, one of the ideas floated around was economic inequality on trial. In that analogy, I guess I'd be the prosecutor, but of course, it would have been a pretty misleading analogy because even if I can convince everyone watching that economic inequality is very, very bad, there is no judge here to enforce a verdict. We can't debate our way to a more equal society. At a certain point, you have to actually log off and do things like talk to your coworkers about organizing a union. But right now, let's talk about why I think egalitarian values are worth going out there to fight for. I'm certainly not going to argue that we should empower some dystopian bureaucracy to ration everything out to make sure everyone has a exactly equal share of every resource. When I say that economic inequality is indeed very bad, I don't mean that anytime anyone has a little bit more than anyone else, that's necessarily unjust. What I do mean is the kind of raging inequality that's normal in contemporary capitalist societies. The average CEO in a large firm earns hundreds of times what the average fully employed worker makes. And a lot of people are doing much worse than that average full-time employee who has a pension and benefits because they're either underemployed or they're overemployed, stringing together gig economy jobs without benefits or any sense of security for the future. And yeah, I find that kind of inequality grotesque. To illustrate why it's grotesque, I could start talking about sweatshops in Haiti that are subsidiaries of crazy wealthy American corporations, or even staying within the borders of the United States. I could talk about the gap in life expectancy between the richest and poorest zip codes. But instead of any of that, I'd actually prefer, I think it might be more instructive even to focus on a mundane, everyday example of what significant economic inequality looks like, the kind of example that feels so normal to people who spent their entire lives living in a grotesquely unequal society that oftentimes, if you're at the bottom end of this, it doesn't even occur to you to think of it as an injustice. It just seems like, yeah, that's how life is. So here's the example. A trust fund kid might be able to spend a gap year in India finding himself between high school and college. Meanwhile, his parents pay their cleaning lady, let's say, they don't just pay her enough for rent and groceries. She has some spending money, but certainly not enough for her to fly off to any of the places that she might like to visit. Her lack of funds stop her from boarding a plane to any of those places in exactly the same way that she'd be stopped if the TSA put her on a no-fly list. In both scenarios, if she tries to board the plane anyway, men with guns will use force to stop her. And that last point is worth circling and underlining. Some people will say, no, we shouldn't be trying to create a more equal society. We shouldn't be thinking about moving from capitalism to some form of democratic socialism, because equality can only be purchased at the cost of freedom. They say capitalism is a system of uncoerced free exchanges, whereas if we try to make society more socialistic by doing things like, for example, nationalizing big corporations, that's coercion. But this is just a rhetorical sleight of hand. Any distribution of scarce resources is ultimately enforced by coercion. That's what's threatened by a no trespassing sign, every bit as much as it's threatened by a bill from the IRS. In fact, in practice, ignoring the first is a hell of a lot more likely to actually lead to a confrontation with armed agents of the state than ignoring the second. So the issue and dispute in arguments about capitalism and socialism and equality and inequality is not coercion, yes or no. It's which distribution of scarce resources should be coercively enforced. And you shouldn't trust anyone who doesn't make that distinction. Now, I've been speaking at a very general, intuitive level, but to make this a little more precise, I think there are at least 4 kinds of objectionable economic inequality. 1, I object to any level of inequality that makes us less free. If you have so much less than others that you're completely dependent on the goodwill of people with more to meet your needs, those people with more have a lot of power to make you do what they want. That kind of soft coercion isn't as bad as slavery or forced labor, but it's still pretty bad. And if there's a good way to restructure economic institutions so no one is put in that situation by their lack of material resources, we should do that. By the way, that point about how capitalism doesn't have to be as bad as even more coercive systems like feudalism or ancient slave systems that existed in the past in order to be bad is the same reason I'm annoyed when people like Steven Pinker make a big deal of pointing out how much better poor people in 2022 have it than their ancestors who lived under previous forms of social organization. My beef isn't that it's false. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's true. Even we don't have to go back to distant ancestors. You know, but my objection is that true or false, it's 100% irrelevant. The same way that racial discrimination in housing or employment was surely less than 0.1% as bad as the Middle Passage, but it was still a serious injustice that needed to be redressed. All right, that's one. Two, I object to inequality in power. The same way it was unjust when women couldn't vote, and the reason it was unjust is there was no good reason why women should have less power over the direction of society than men. That exact same objection applies to any kind of economic inequality severe enough to result in an inequality of political influence in the state. And the point about equality of power applies just as much to what goes on within a workplace. In fact, grotesque levels of inequality in distribution of resources are not totally, but to a great extent, downstream from inequality of power within firms. In a worker co-op where everyone gets to vote on wage scales, you won't necessarily get a completely equal distribution. You might convince your fellow workers that you need to get paid a little more to give you a reason to take on positions with more responsibility and stress, or conversely, for doing particularly dirty and unpleasant jobs. But good luck trying to convince them that you have to get hundreds of times more than they get. Three, even in a society that wasn't divided into workers and capitalists, if it worked out that economic inequality got so severe that people at the bottom end had just a dramatically worse quality of life because of that, miserable, stressed out about money all the time, can't spend time with their loved ones, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and making the distribution of material resources more equal would correct that situation, then at least all else being equal, I think a principle of communal caring gives us a reason to do that the same way you might spend some of your individual resources on helping a family member who is in trouble. And no, I don't think it's realistic or even necessarily desirable for everyone to care exactly as much about random strangers as they care about their own families. But there is a hell of a gap separating caring about someone quite that much from being so callous towards them that you let them sink to the point where they have to start a GoFundMe to pay for their medical bills. Four, I believe in equality of opportunity. That means that if there's a reasonable way to avoid this, no one should have less access to the resources they need to live a better version of their life because of factors outside of their control. This is the exact reason why we think it's outrageous, for example, if members of racial minority groups have a smaller share of society's resources just because of the color of their skin. Lack of access to resources because of factors outside of your control. Now, a lot of defenders of the capitalist status quo would say, oh, we agree with you about that one. We also believe in equality of opportunity. But the fact is, they really don't, or at least they don't believe in any particularly deep version of it. Because if, for example, some people can inherit fortunes from their parents, and all they have to do is not fritter it away, and other people have to work two jobs and drive an Uber at night to make ends meet, that's a clear-cut case of some people having less access to scarce resources than others do because of factors outside of their control. Now, you will notice that I've used a few phrases like all else being equal, or if there's a good way to do this. And the reason I've used those phrases is because I'm speaking at the level of values, but I do recognize that politics is complicated. And sometimes important values have to be balanced against other values that are also important. And this is the last point I want to get into before I throw it to Josh. If you can convince me that we have to allow large-scale inequality because the only alternative is economic collapse and everyone being way worse off than even the worst off people are now, so that someone in the society we live in right now, for example, who's working two jobs and what I just said, driving an Uber at night to pay for rent and groceries, but still manages to make enough to pay for food for themselves and litter and cat food for their cats, we're saying in this hypothetical that if things were made more equal, there'd be so little to go around that they'd have to resort to eating those cats so they didn't starve to death. If you can convince me of that those were the options, then sure, I would reluctantly allow large-scale inequality as a necessary evil. I'd still think it was evil, but I might be convinced that it was a necessary evil. But I'll end by just saying that if anyone seriously wants to make the case that there's no way to make our society, at the very least, dramatically more equal than it is right now, without making the worse off people worse off than they are already, well, as the subject of that book I mentioned earlier might put it, all your work is still ahead of you. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.